like to really thank Professors Malik and Pavrala for inviting me for this very important event that is a celebration of Professor Sanjay's life and achievements. And his really, I'm glad that you set the scene because it's major achievements that you've been involved in, both in terms of academia, but also to the administration of universities. I also will go back to some of those old stories. I remember Professor Eapen in about 1988, 89. He had come to Madurai where I was teaching, and he was really excited about this bright young academic who was writing this path-breaking thesis on the political economy of communications at Simon Fraser. Okay, how time has flown since then, Sanjay, and what an exciting and extraordinary career that you've had at the helm of academia in India. And I think, you, like Vinod said, you were at a wonderful institution because it was a perfect place to do a thesis on the political economy of satellite in India, in the presence of really stalwart scholars. In the presence of stalwart scholars like, Dallas Smythe and others. And I think for someone like me who's done work in the area of political economy, people like Dallas Smythe were, really important figures because they contributed to our understandings how, for example, how the audience commodity works, and the kind of media's ceaseless enlisting of audiences in their own commodification. And of course, today, we're dealing with similar issues, given the fact that similar things are happening in the area of social media. And we have, scholars such as Christian Fuchs and Mark Andrzejewicz, and among others, who continue to work on this whole business of audience commodification. I'm not going to deal with some of the kind of major issues that Padmaja outlined in her introduction, but with some of the continuing issues from Sanjay's thesis, the whole issue of, for example, technology transfer, and in particular in the satellite industry in India, okay? And also deal with that contentious issue of who benefits in the context of media development in this country. Let me begin with two quotations that I'm sure Professor Sanjay is familiar with. Firstly, okay, and I quote, "The transfer of satellite technology to India was based on high hopes for achieving desired socio-economic goals. The experience so far has been that the actual benefits to the intended audience, the bulk of the rural population, have been far less than anticipated. This thesis is an analysis of the gaps that exist between the promise and performance of satellite technology in India. The analysis is specifically directed to explain how and why these gaps exist by examining the structure and role of major political and economic institutions in decision-making at various levels." So that's quote number one. Two, the second one is, and again I quote, "International technology transfer is not neutral. It is not simply a gadget or tool that is transferred. Consequences result from its various and unique applications. These applications are initially shaped within the institutional framework of the country in which the technology originates and provide powerful though distorted images of the incentives that exist." Okay? Both these quotations are from the introduction and conclusion of Professor Sanjay's thesis, which is entitled "The Role of Institutional Relationships in Communication Technology Transfer, a Case Study of the Indian National Satellite System, INSAT, 1989. Okay? So, in many ways, looking at that work, Sanjay's thesis is what I would call a very classic critical political economy of communications. Given that it is historical, it is holistic, it is very grounded, and I think most importantly, it's about the politics and geopolitics and consequences of technology transfer in the context of various institutional relationships that we continue to very blithely ignore in many of our studies, those institutional relationships, right? Because of course, all of us are now, kind of enthused by information technologies that are routinely described as the great leveler, right? And that's why we have so much investments in information technology today. But I much prefer the political economist Vincent Mosco's descriptor of this fascination with all things digital. He calls it the digital sublime, right? And that's a better term to use in our understanding of this enthusiasm that we have with technology today. Okay. And then, of course, there's also that moral kind of purpose to the thesis, captured by recommendations of what ought to be, right, in this business of technology transfer. Again, extraordinarily important issues. There is a moral issue to all this. And I think as good political economists of communications will deal with that issue, right, and really deal with that well. Okay. So when you look at the satellite industry in India 30 years later, we can all be justifiably proud of the extraordinary achievements that India's satellite and space programs have achieved. Major milestones, including recently using one of our missiles to knock out a defunct satellite, right? These are major achievements. The fact that India is no longer a gross recipient of satellite technology, but an exporter of such technologies in the international business of satellite production, space launch, ground applications, is nothing short of remarkable. Having said that, and while many of the problems the country had with its attempts to import cryogenic engines from the USSR and the bans on such imports from the USA are no longer the case, there arguably remain issues with the import of dual-use technologies that can be used for both peaceful and for defense purposes, space exploration and missile development. Okay? So Sanjay's observations regarding the transfers of technology and the fact that neither technology nor its consequences are neutral is a perfect starting point for understanding this new brave world of technology that we are all a part of. I have over the last couple of years got interested in reading and writing about the politics and geopolitics of digital platforms and infrastructures in India, from telecommunications to the project of Digital India and the kind of transactional economy that we are all part of. There have been some very interesting work on the material effects of information infrastructures. And two scholars stand out, Brian Larkin and Lisa Parks, who are among scholars who have done some really thought-provoking work in an area known as infrastructure studies. Okay. They have argued that infrastructures are always layered, built on top of previous technologies. And this is certainly the case with, say, oceanic cables in India. The majority of, say, landing stations in India that continue to be used today were built during the era of empire. And I've just completed a book on empire and post-empire telecommunications. And it's fascinating that when you explore things like oceanic cables, people don't write about oceanic cables, right, in India. And yet, I understand that about 95% of external data goes through these oceanic cables. It's not through satellites, right? It's amazing that so much data flows through oceanic cables, okay? And yet, the landing sites still continue to follow the old imperial lines, right? We have a handful of landing sites in India, and generally the most important ones are the ones that were established during the time of empire, okay? So there are extraordinary continuities between empire and post-empire infrastructures, right, that I find interesting. Then, of course, another example of this is the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885, right, that some of us are very familiar with. It continues to remain the root legislation that gives the government of India the powers to operate wired and wireless services. Of course, some of you also may know that in 2000, a telecom panel led by Fali Nariman was asked to review this act in the context of all the major challenges to communications, including convergence. There was a communications convergence bill in 2000 that was to have led to the formation of a single regulatory authority, the Communications Commission of India, founded on the repeal of the 1885 and other acts enacted during the empire. This was to be, but it was never to be, right? The fact that this bill was shelved suggests that the political establishment was not ready to relinquish any control, right? The 1885 Act gave the British the power to control, establish, and intercept communications. And this Act continues today to buttress the expansive investments in surveillance via the Information Technology Act 2000 and the central monitoring system. Right? Another example of continuities is the transfer of technology from the age of empire to post-independence India. For example, Victorian technological infrastructures, railways, electricity, the telegraph, were all transferred to India during its independence. These technologies were lauded as the epitome of English ingenuity that was at the heart of Western civilization. But it's fascinating when you look at the history of these technologies that it's not just the technologies that were introduced. The civilizing mission of these technologies had profound material impacts on India, but it also contributed to values and ideas that became predominant. For example, values and ideas that kind of influenced our mental infrastructures, our consciousness. And one of the examples of this is railway timetables, right? Railway timetables that accompanied railways, okay? But it's also hastened the centralization and the establishment of a single temporal order in India. Time, Indian Standard Time, right? That was linked to the Greenwich Meridian in London, right? The temporalities that existed on the subcontinent for millennia, based on cultural time, ritual time, seasonal time, all these had to make their peace with and become subservient to a scientific understanding of time that, in the specific case of railways, helped in the more rational movement of goods and people that were critical to the cause of empire, right? And to imperial economic and military power. So it does not come as any surprise that the first telegraph lines in India were laid adjacent to and accompanied railway lines, given the obvious need to also control the flows of information on trade that was critical to the business of empire. Technologies are not neutral, right? And in the case of empire, technologies that were primarily introduced to streamline the kind of more effective husbandry of empire. Okay, that was the reality. Now, from infrastructures, we also learned that that all infrastructures are actually learned, meaning that each of us learns to negotiate our relationships with infrastructure, be it roads or the internet. So, taken in this sense, the first independent government of India had their work cut out, since they had to democratize access to infrastructure and technologies that were developed primarily to serve British and their compradors, right? Indians in newly independent India had to learn to negotiate these new structures, technology structures. Learning to negotiate technology, not just to use it, remains a hugely vexed issue in the India of today because of the fact that there seems to be no time for us to learn about these digital devices, right? That have taken over our lives, and the Internet of Things that is about to kind of further ensconce us in this digital embrace. In this sense, the need for media and digital education, right? Another area where Sanjay's imprint is apparent, has of course attained critical importance today in India and elsewhere, given the many opportunities that exist to manipulate, amplify, distort, orchestrate, abuse data for one purpose or the other. An issue that, as Padma has said, is live today. And some of you who are so inclined may want to read Sahana Udupa's excellent piece on election 2019 in the EPW. India needs a fresh strategy to tackle online extreme speech. And that's an excellent article on what needs to be done in the context of this sphere. Okay? But to come back to empire technology and the issue of neutrality, it is unsurprising that the sepoys during the 1857 mutiny targeted the railways, but critically the telegraph. Okay? Both seen as technologies of empire that were perceived to be symbols of oppression, technologies that aided empire as a form of control, infrastructures were not meant for the common man, but for the oppressor class, infrastructures that could not be learned by the common man, and negotiated because it was not made for them in the first place. In Britain, of course, the Luddites had demonstrated that when livelihoods were at stake, new technologies such as the spinning mill that made home-based weavers superfluous were to be destroyed. Okay? And the penalty levied on those who got caught destroying these new infrastructures of weaving was nothing less than capital punishment. Okay? Arguably, the very same attitude to infrastructure exists among Maoist groups in India today, okay, who routinely attack and destroy the infrastructures of modernity, roads, bridges, and interestingly, for our purposes, telephone towers and other informational infrastructures. In other words, I'm trying to say that infrastructures can be both boon and bane, and what is beneficial to one person can also be an obstacle to another, who holds on to a contrary view on the idea of progress and the means to achieve progress. Okay? So So in other words, technology arguably is never benign. It has effects and consequences, and it's always contested. Okay. For example, even today there's contestation over infrastructure in the Kashmir Valley. For example, in 2018, close to 133 internet shutdowns within the Kashmir Valley. Okay. Although people use virtual private networks to access banned and proscribed sites. Okay. To come back to satellites, let me begin with a quote from Lisa Parks and Karen Kaplan on their work on drones. Okay. In the introduction to their work on drones, they suggest that drones need to be perceived not only in terms of power-laden military technologies, but also as cultural imaginaries. Okay. And I quote, "Drones are not idle machines hovering above. They are loaded with certain assumptions and ideologies. They operationalize fantasies and produce psychological states ranging from fear to fury, vulnerability to vengeance, anxiety to security. Drones should not only be thought of as high-tech machines of militaries or states, they're also ideas, they're designs, visions, plans, and strategies that affect civilians on the ground, pilots in the remote cockpit, and consumers in the marketplace." Again, technology is not neutral. Drones are used to survey disaster sites, but also to kill enemies, and often cause massive collateral damage. Okay? Arguably, when looking at satellites as infrastructure in India, also, I think satellites also kind of belongs to that widely shared cultural imaginary about the science and technology community, about the state, about citizens. Key to this are two imaginaries. The first one is about the idea of sovereignty. Okay? The idea of sovereignty meaning control, authority, autonomy. A sovereignty that is in the process of being earned and established in the context of continuing geopolitical rivalries related to technology transfers, especially with the USA. Okay? So that's one type of sovereignty. The second one is spatial sovereignty, right? That is being contested by the widespread availability of cartographic modes of information, such as Google Earth. Again, an issue of real concern for the government today. There's also the issue of individual sovereignty in all this, right? For example, the individual sovereignty that is being both enhanced and compromised through the state's numerous governmentality projects, right? So you can look at sovereignty at a variety of levels, okay? But there's also, and I think this is the second cultural imaginary, the cultural imaginary of progress, which is part of this vision. And this idea of progress is, of course, key to all technology development projects in India, and encapsulated in slogans such as Achhe Din and India Shining. Right? These are all about infrastructural projects that will lead to a more prosperous, equitable India. Although, shall I say it again, technologies are not neutral, as we have seen with the highs and lows of the Aadhaar UID project and the many shades of governmentality linked to this particular project. But of course, we also have to agree that success has been achieved. I mean, if you, for example, look at the Bhumi project in Karnataka or the IT at Schools project in Kerala, these projects have in different ways affected the lives of farmers and students. And we have to say that these are important initiatives. And yet, as Akhil Gupta in his admirable book Red Tape has pointed out, while progress has been achieved, there is a gargantuan bureaucracy that progress has had to deal with, right? And this gargantuan bureaucracy is part of a multi-level state in which the various levels at times are at odds with each other, right? Compete with one another to impede development. And these different levels have contributed to the normalizing of indifference, according to Akhil Gupta, resulting in persistent kind of structural violence against some of the most vulnerable communities in the country. I'm sure that Sanjay, in his many years working with government, has come across this called Sarkar Babus in India, and the intended and unintended consequences of the kind of development state. Gupta's work paints the big picture, and I think one of the strengths of a political economy-inspired based approach is that it attempts to understand the bits and pieces that make up the big picture, thus enabling an understanding of the gaps between ideological promise and institutional performance. And this is something, again, that Sanjay's thesis actually is achieved, right? the whole gap between ideological promise and institutional performance. So I think one of the questions for those partial to a political economy approach is, if, as I have argued, infrastructures are learned, what education is necessary for a people to both understand infrastructure and, more importantly, are empowered enough to use infrastructure for their own ends rather than become subservient to infrastructures, right? And one can argue that, a movement such as the right to information movement in India has enabled a certain understanding of infrastructure. People, for example, they demystified opaque local government data on development, and people learned about that and understood that these are important things as citizens, right? Important things to be done as citizens. They were able to see the kind of the seen and unseen versions of development, right? The people were able to kind of understand the official version and the unofficial version of development, all those kinds of things. So that's one of the key questions that need to be asked. And I know that people like Vinod, Kanchan, and, for example, Vasuki, who's not here, will have a lot to say on whether community radio's infrastructure in India has contributed to citizen-centric development. Has community radio actually led to people understanding and being empowered and making their own voices heard? I use a really good example from Latin America, a group called Rhizomatica, who've been involved in setting up community telecoms in Mexico among indigenous people. And it's fascinating. When I started work, trying to understand what they did, it's amazing what people have done, and in the process of doing things, have actually empowered communities to organize and control, manage their own telecom, operations, which I find really, really fascinating. So we do have examples of that, and I think it's important that we have more examples of those kinds of things. Okay, I'd like to just conclude by getting back where I started again on satellite. Like I said, the satellite industry has done extraordinarily important work in this country, and yet, by and large, it still remains a public sector enterprise, and that's fascinating, really, really fascinating. Okay, it's now the envy of many countries, including those that were at one time far ahead of India in this industry. Okay, that's a reality today. The fact that India regularly launches a variety of satellites, including on one occasion more than 100 microsatellites, that it has one of the most extensive fleet of remote sensing satellites in the world, and has a proven and successful launch vehicles, including the Polar satellite launch vehicle and the geosynchronous launch vehicle, has alerted the world to the country's prowess in this technology. However, there is a need to remind ourselves that the development of the geosynchronous launch vehicle was delayed by 14 years, okay, given a US embargo on the export of cryogenic engines. Okay. India then signed a contract with the Russian agency Glavkosmos in 1991 to supply these engines, although this company withdrew after threats of US sanctions. Right? So we've got that history, though, that institutional history of dealing with these kinds of relationships that have not always worked to the advantage of India over the last many years. At that time, the reason given by the USA for not supplying this technology was that supply by either USA or Russia would compromise the missile technology control regime that was established to curb exports of dual-use technology. However, people have argued that the real reasons for the embargo was to curb India becoming the location for relatively inexpensive satellite launches. Okay? A direct threat to NASA and the launch industry in the USA, an issue that remains live even today. So what I'm trying to say is that issues of technology transfer exist even today. So while on the one hand, partnerships with NASA have deepened, ISRO, NASA partnerships, including the 1.5 billion synthetic aperture radar project, there is still only a grudging acceptance of an industry that for all practical purposes is located in the public sector. And the US can't handle the fact that much of this work is being done in the public sector. This is a big issue for them. Okay. Cody Knipfer, writing in the Space Review, explains that the real reasons for continuing angst in the USA over India's satellite program is as follows. The debate over the PSLV revolves around a US Trade Representative review of a current ban on US satellite use of the PSLV. The ban dates to a commercial space launch agreement in 2005. And these kinds of agreements are the US government's method for protecting the domestic launch industry from competing government-controlled foreign launches, such as the PSLV, which is operated by Antrix Corporation of India, which is the commercial arm of the Indian space program. These agreements set American commercial launch prices as the minimum for government-owned non-US launch providers. India has to date refused to sign the CSLA, leading the US government to issue its ban. Okay. That last sentence is quite extraordinary and reminds us that US imperialism is alive and well, and that it simply needs to remain on the radar for those writing on the political economy of information and communications in India and elsewhere. From the perspective of the free market, it is absolutely inconceivable for a public sector entity to succeed in its mission. They just can't understand how a public sector entity can do this. While the Indian space industry does contract supplies from a variety of private and public equipment manufacturers, engineering services, R&D institutions, and suppliers, and does have a commercial platform, Antrix Corporation, that offers transponder services, data products, ground system, launch procurement services, the critique remains that the private sector will do a lot better than the public sector when it comes to space. Today, there are private organizations such as the Bengaluru-based Dhruva Space, Team Indus, Astrom Technologies, Bellatrix Aerospace, along with others that are attempting to compete. Although India's public investment across a network of space centers, satellite centers, remote sensing centers, space applications, R&D outfits at the Indian Institute of Science, Indian Institute of Technologies, and elsewhere is just too strong a network to compete with, at least for the moment. In fact, while private firms such as Godrej, Tata's, L&T, Mahindra's, and the state-run Hindustan Aeronautics Limited have supplied critical systems and spacecraft parts to ISRO's launch vehicle, such firms are yet to supply an entire launch vehicle to ISRO, and ISRO has consistently avoided giving them contracts. So that is the reality of India's space game today. Irrespective of the politics of space in India, and there are of course a number of issues there, it is quite amazing that so much has been achieved despite the lack of a national space policy, which is also pretty fascinating. The flagship Digital India project does not even mention the word satellite, right? And yet, much of this stuff happens because of satellite, right? I mention this because for those students present here who have been inspired by Sanjay's work, there are a number of issues that can be explored within the framework of political economy, some that have been kind of mentioned in this very brief presentation. Technology transfer still remains an important issue and that needs to be explored in the context of understanding the technology, the information technology sector in India, and also other sectors. Of course, it is a real big issue in the pharmaceutical sector in India that is facing major challenges from the US Trade Representative and its Special 301 review that specifically wants the Government of India issuing compulsory licenses to companies involved in marketing generic products, although at the same time the US wants to patent its pharma products in India. So there are these continuing issues. While the government is warm to this idea, this is antithetical to its own patents policy and its support for the production of generics in the case of national emergencies. The 2018 Section 301 review has placed India on the priority watch list, along with 11 other countries, including Canada, the Ukraine, and has explicitly targeted India's Patent Act, IP enforcement, and inability to control counterfeits. So that's the reality today. In other words, technology transfers still remain a big issue today. Okay? Not just technology transfers, but the crucial issue of who benefits are bound to remain public concerns in the years to come. And I think Sanjay's work has highlighted issues that simply cannot be wished away. These are real issues that are, that have continued, and some people are working in these areas, continue to work in these kinds of areas. They have to be confronted and understood within the context of the times that we live in, and the pressures that are continue to be exerted by dominant politics and economics. So, just in conclusion, I'd like to thank Sanjay for showing us the way, for dealing with some of those issues, well back in the 1980s when people never even thought of these kinds of issues. The fact that these issues are still live today, I think, is something that you need to take back as an important contribution that you've made to our understandings of political economy. So I wish you well, Sanjay, in your continuing work, and I'm sure you'll have a busy and enjoyable future. So thanks very much. Thank you.